The honourable member for Vancouver East.
As the NDP critic for multiculturalism, I'm pleased to rise in this House to support M126, Portuguese Heritage Month. I've always been proud of the NDP's support of multiculturalism in Canada. My colleagues and I always welcome the opportunity to celebrate the unique heritage of Canada and the contributions made by so many different ethnic and religious groups. Portuguese Canadians have a rich cultural history and heritage, with many traditions having been brought over and continuing to flourish in the various little Portugals of Canadian cities today. With nearly 500,000 Canadians having Portuguese heritage, the tie created between Canada and Portugal is significant. This motion provides Canadians with the opportunity to understand, appreciate, and join in the celebration of traditions and heritage of the Portuguese community. I believe this also gives us an opportunity to look at what Portugal is doing today that Canada can learn from. During the 1990s, Portugal was experiencing a national crisis regarding heroin addiction. At its height, 1 out of 100 Portuguese citizens were using heroin. Overdose deaths were robbing families of their loved ones far too soon, and dirty needles were contributing to the highest levels of HIV infections in Europe. A little over 15 years ago, Portugal made a decision that things needed to change, the realization the current approach simply wasn't working. Portugal embraced the harm reduction approach, understanding that addiction issues were better suited to be addressed by the healthcare system and social welfare system than the criminal justice system. Portugal took what seemed like a radical step to many peer nations, decriminalizing minor possessions of all drugs and dramatically shifting their resources away from the criminal justice system towards health and social services. Instead, if an individual is caught possessing what was deemed an amount equivalent to individual possession, they are sent to report to a warning commission on drug addiction. Here, they are assessed by social workers and other healthcare professionals, referred to treatment centers if appropriate. Instead of criminal charges tying up the courts and criminal records with lifelong impacts, individuals are referred to services that will actually help them and given fines equal to parking tickets. Those against these ideas suggested it would be the end of Portugal, that people from all over the world would flock there simply to use and abuse drugs. This would simply make things worse. Nearly 2 decades later, the fear-mongering was shown to be just that. Drug-caused deaths in Portugal has fallen well below the European Union's average. New HIV infections due to drug use have dropped from over 1,000 cases in 2001 to less than 100 in 2013. Overall drug use has actually gone down. As I have said in the House before, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The Portuguese model has saved lives, reduced infection rates, and alleviated the burden on the criminal justice system that drug use and addiction causes in countries like our own. It is clear that as Canada grapples with the current opioid crisis, that there is much we can learn from Portugal. The success of harm reduction in East Vancouver, most noteworthy with the establishment of Insight, is undisputable. But that's not enough. We need more sites. We need more funding for treatment options, including expanded heroin maintenance programs and services. We need to make more use of the healthcare system and less use of the justice system. We need to support the frontline workers and first responders. We need to call it for what it is, a national health emergency. And in just the first week, in his first week back to the West Coast after becoming leader of the NDP, Jagmeet Singh stated, and I quote, "Thousands of people are dying in our country as a result of this crisis, and it needs to be named a national crisis first." He also noted the Portuguese model of harm reduction resulted in a dramatic decrease in overdose deaths and reduction in addictions. He said, and I quote, "That should be the focus if we really want to address the opioid crisis and really want to reduce the significant and terrible deaths. Canada can and should learn from the Portuguese model." Aside from the opioid crisis, Portugal is also concerned with climate change. Portugal's geographic location on the Iberian Peninsula has brought the impacts of climate change to the forefront for them. It is believed that this region will hit significant will be hit significantly hard by climate change impacts. This past summer, Portugal, like Canada, experienced devastating wildfires. It's believed that the impacts of climate change have lengthened Portugal's wildfire season from 2 months a year to up to 5 months of the year. The European Environment Agency reported this year that Portugal has lost 6.8 billion euros as a result of climate change from the 1980s to 2013 alone. Portugal has committed to the Paris Agreement and made ambitious goals to combat climate change. The Climate Change Performance Index, which is an index by German Watch and the European Climate Action Network, ranked Portugal 11th in the world for 2017 compared to Canada's at 55. It was noted that Portugal was one of the only 2 countries that leapt from, quote, moderate performance into, quote, good performance, whereas for Canada, they wrote, quote, without significant movements in either direction, Canada remains in the bottom group of most CCPI categories. The only sector where the country ranks in the middle of the field is the emissions development, but even there it lost some ground, end quote. In June, the Portuguese Prime Minister reported that Portugal had already achieved over 87% of its 2020 goal. Unfortunately, our Prime Minister can't say the same. Despite this government's sunny ways, they have only committed to reach the former Conservative government's climate targets for 2030, targets which were hardly considered world-leading then or now. Unless a dramatic change of course occurs, Canada will not meet our targets for 2020 or 2030. Finally, coming out of the global financial crisis, many countries, Canada included, adopted an austerity mantra. Social services were cut, and in some cases, deeply. Austerity measures have always clearly had the biggest impact on the vulnerable segments of our population, and this is true here in Canada or anywhere abroad. In much of Europe, where the crisis hit harder than here, even deeper cuts and austerity demands impacted the lives of countless people already struggling to get by. The Portugal government, elected in 2015, determined that it would not take that approach. Much like the reaction to Portugal's harm reduction measures, many said this would prove to be a disaster. Their government has moved to an indexed minimum wages, reverse regressive tax measures, reinvested in the public service through wages and pensions, has increased Social Security for lower-income families, and introduced a luxury charge on homes worth over 600,000 euros. After 1 year with these changes in effect, GDP was up, corporate investment was up, deficit spending halved to the lowest point in 40 years, and the economy has grown for 13 straight quarters and counting. Portugal is investing in its people to grow its economy and appears to be working. Canada can and needs to do more to invest in our people to grow our economy. Too often we put vulnerable groups against vulnerable groups. Instead of tackling tax havens and loopholes in our tax system used by only the wealthiest to avoid paying their fair share, this government floated tax measures that would have impacted small business owners and even measures that impacted minimum wage retail workers. Portuguese Canadians should be proud not just of their Portuguese heritage and history, but also of the present. While celebrating Portuguese Day in June, Canadians with or without Portuguese heritage should not just learn more about its history, but learn more about today. It is through this exchange of dialogue that Canada can continue to push to be as great as we possibly can. This is one of the great aspects of Canada's multiculturalism policy and one of the reasons why I am proud to support this motion.